Sometimes I felt the whole world was converging on this little room, and as I became more intoxicated and frustrated, I'd throw open the bedroom window as the dawn came up. I wanted my life to begin now, at this instant, just when I was ready for it, the Buddha of Suburbia. I spent so much time in my bedroom. It really was my entire world. I had books up there, my music up there, my record player. Going from my world upstairs out onto the street, I had to pass through this no man's land of the living room, you know, and out the front hall. That is 2 paragraphs from Hanif Kurish's The Buddha of Suburbia. And today on Notcast 256, I'm going to be talking about 2 David Bowie albums, which surprisingly have their 30th birthdays next year. Black Tie, White Noise and The Buddha of Suburbia, both of whom albums I think are really staggeringly underrated in his body of work. Today is the 27th of December 2022, so there's still a week left of 2022 before we get into 2023, the year, no doubt, of some awful science fiction movies. It's been a couple of months since I've talked about David Bowie, and obviously life has been happening in the meantime. As I've mentioned previously, I have been working, I've been on the road, I've been travelling, I've been seeing family, I've been doing things that don't involve talking about my record collection to my mobile phone. But here you are, thank you and welcome back. And today we're going to talk about David Bowie's, I think it's his 15th studio album and 16th. Hang on, I will just quickly check those numbers. Okay, so I was wrong. Black Tie, White Noise is David Bowie's 18th studio album and Buddha of Suburbia is the 19th, or if you include Tin Machine, the 20th and 21st, which for someone who'd been making records for 25 years was pretty damn admirable. There'd never been a period of huge silence from David. He'd never really gone to the period of, you know, leaving it 4 or 5 years between the release of his albums, unlike certain bands who clearly just saw the touring cycle as something they did every 4 years, an album they did every 4 years, and then 2 years of being really quiet, which to me just kind of gets the feeling that it's a plaything and the band are partially retired. But for this period, I think there's a sense of finding life and finding meaning in life through art and through work, which was, I think, something which reflected in his records. So Black Tie, White Noise, album number 18 or 20. They're looking extremely dapper on the 2021 EMI repressing of the album. And I'll be really honest, I didn't buy this when it came out. I didn't buy this when it came out because I was a student. I was dirt poor. I had very little money, and all my money was spent on going out and seeing bands, which were about £3.50 or something equally astronomically expensive at the time. And I could always just, you know, take the record off my friends and live that way. So when this came out, you know, an album by a man who was what, 44 or something, and I always used to be able to peg my life by going, well, when I was his age, David Bowie was in Tin Machine, so I'm clearly, you know, doing better than he was. You know, by this point, and by the way, I think I'm older now than David was when this came out, I have to rate myself against what David was doing around about the time of Earthling, and I kind of go, yeah, you're probably cooler than me. So there we have it. So Black Tie, White Noise, the 20th studio album released by David Bowie on the 2nd of April 1993. This album did not sell particularly well, at least in America, for one very significant reason. The reason being is that his record company effectively went bankrupt the next month, ran out of money, had to sack 23 staff, and had completely disappeared by September. So the idea of David actually kind of like having an album that had legs just clearly wasn't going to be likely or viable at all. This album was, I think it was the first time where David had started writing about his own life in a more direct and open manner, as opposed to an abstract format which he'd used previously. All of his other songs were ambiguous, I think, lyrically, and they were records where he was talking about, commenting upon what he could see and what he could feel, as opposed to what he was feeling or what he was actually seeing. So it was observations of other humans, like transmissions from an alien called Ziggy Stardust to a remote alien planet, going, this is what life's like on Earth. They're mostly harmless, that type of thing. This was something that was a little bit more direct, and this was clearly inspired by the way, and a huge number of the songs have their genus in the fact that David had met his partner Iman, and they got married, and both of them were relatively well known and famous before they became a couple. And so the marriage of them was almost like a merger of a conglomerate into, you know, Thorn EMI, as opposed to just two separate companies. And there's a line in the title track, Black Tie, White Noise, where he sings about getting your news from a Benetton ad. And that's kind of a tacit and almost a little bit cheeky bitchy response to the fact that, you know, his life was an act of celebrity, whether he liked it or not. Everyone had an opinion about it. You know, one of the things that, for example, if you are somebody who's famous, not that I have ever been so, is that people know far, far more about you than you know about them. And so I think Noel Gallagher once said, you know, you meet people at parties, and he never wanted to do any talking because people already know who I am. They know what my job is. They've already got an opinion about me. I'm far more interested in what they do. You know, don't bullshit me going, who are you and what do you do? Although, of course, I did once meet a well-known football player who was a little bit arrogant and didn't necessarily comprehend that I didn't know anything about football. So as far as I could see, he was just a grumpy middle-aged bloke, as opposed to, oh, it's him who's played the matches and done the things. I'm like, so? Okay, who are you? Poof. Exactly. Anyway, I'm rambling, and I should be talking about this fine record. This was I think the first time where David had clearly kind of turned his back on Tin Machine and became captain of his own ship again. As I said, it was inspired by the LA riots, which had occurred. So when Iman and David had got married, I think they flew to LA, they landed, and by the time they got to their hotel, the LA riots had kicked off, which I think was about April 1992 or thereabouts. I remember watching it on television in my student flat in Leicester, and kind of going, ah, right, that's the thing that's happening. You know, the idea of, you know, these two people that had found themselves in love in a time of cholera, for example, and then suddenly were surrounded by, you know, riots and war and rioting in the streets, and they were like, oh, well, all the things that are real for us are not real for anybody else in the city at this point in time. Very interesting from an artistic perspective, in much the same way as, for example, parts of my personal life became absolutely amazing around about the time the world went to complete shit. So, for example, about the time where my life settled into a set of stasis, a kind of like, if you're a human being, you're always working towards creating a world which you like, and you're constantly working towards that and constantly tending it like a constant gardener. Is you're constantly trimming the weeds and trying to make life the thing that you want it to be. And yet, when you achieve that state, you go, right, this is how I want it to be. It never remains. Everything changes around it, and then all of a sudden you're in a position where you're suddenly kind of going, okay, so once I close the door, the house that I'm in, the world that I'm in is lovely, but the outside world is terrible. And so I look at, you know, the state of world politics and affairs as being very, very clearly around the introduction of, or the election of, the Conservative Party in 2010 as the start of a period of managed decline for the UK. The last time when England really felt someplace that was particularly hopeful was the Olympic ceremonies in 2012, 10 long years ago now. And since then, despite my personal life being generally pretty darn good, you know, the outside world has deteriorated dramatically in that time, both in terms of politics, the level of discourse that you've got, the economic and financial outlooks, even something like the weather. But there you are. So Black Tie, White Noise was, I think, a reflection of David's experience of something broadly similar to that. So the point where you kind of go, well, my personal life is finally, you know, in the direction I want it to be, but the rest of the world seems to be falling apart. It was a revisiting and an updating of some of his previous sounds. So the albums that it's got its closest relations to are Let's Dance and Young Americans, in my opinion. There's a use of funk bass lines, there's a use of then contemporary kind of R&B, kind of like rhythms and stuff. Nile Rodgers was back on board. And again, I listened to this album today and I thought, it's really good. But at the same point, it's a tiny bit flabby, and it's probably a really good David Bowie album is probably around about number 20, 21 in if you had to rank his albums. Whereas, you know, but this would easily be amongst the best albums that anybody else would make, which is probably why David Bowie is generally regarded as so darn good. And it was rock album, but it was also rooted in blues. It was a modern interpretation of the David Bowie that you'd come to know 20 years previously, as I've said, and the revisiting, as I said, Young Americans and Let's Dance. It took the #1 spot in the UK. It deposed the debut album by one of my favourite bands, the Suades, and took that album off the #1 spot. And if you're going to have your debut album knocked off the #1 spot by anybody, can't really argue with David Bowie, can you? Because he's you know, pretty much, you know, like a Mount Rushmore of rock, a status and an icon. Which always reminds me of the time when I saw Jude Law, actually. And he was standing in a dark place and his face was lit by a cigarette, and he was smoking backstage at Brixton Academy. And didn't have a clue. I was looking at him. He was just sat there smoking, having a quiet minute to himself, and I was just sat there just going, I'm looking at an icon being iconic, and they don't know. They're just standing there. They're just doing their thing. You know, they're just having a fag backstage at Brixton, which, by the way, was over 20 years ago now. And this was the same thing that you had with David Bowie, is whether it was good or not, it became good by virtue of the fact that it was David Bowie. So the album is 12 songs. On the original vinyl edition, it was missing, I think, a couple of instrumentals, because vinyl was hardly ever produced. I remember seeing the vinyl in, I think it was Sam's Records in Leicester for £6.99, and there were literally racks of it. You couldn't give it away, because nobody was buying vinyl in those days. So the 2021 edition here on EMI that was released in the Brilliant Adventure box set is a double LP, bringing the album back to its original length. It opens and closes with The Wedding and The Wedding Song. Now, The Wedding is an instrumental version of the track. The Wedding Song is you know, an alternate take of the same song, effectively, which actually is very similar to the opening and closing effect that we have on Buddha of Suburbia. The opening track and the closing track are variations upon the same theme, and with Black Tie, White Noise. It was also, I think, the first of David's albums that really was backwards looking. So this and Buddha of Suburbia, which I probably shouldn't have put down, are the two albums where David starts to address his past, his history, and his legacy. Even from something as blatant as in the track You've Been Around, where he introduces the stutter from ch-ch-ch changes. So when he sings about something changing, he brings that stutter in to, for example, in Buddha from Suburbia, or Buddha of Suburbia, where he's talking very clearly about, in his lyrics and in the songs, and also in the TV show, which the album is the soundtrack to, his childhood growing up in Bromley in that little bedroom, which was effectively his world. Second track on the album is You've Been Around, and You've Been Around is a cover version. No, it isn't a cover version. It's an original, which I think was performed by Tin Machine once in 1989. And it was also issued, the Tin Machine version of it was issued in a remixed form in 1995 on Reeves Gabrel's solo LP, The Sacred Squall of Now. So that's David was Magpie. If he had something, he'd always work at it again. So tracks like People from Bad Homes, I Am a Laser, for example, those type of songs, he didn't forget. He always went back, he looked at them again, he tried to make them work. He did the same thing with You've Been Around, although this time it's officially credited to Reeves and to Bowie and Reeves as writers, as opposed to anybody else. But it was played in the first Tin Machine gig, I think in 1989, in Preston, I think, of all places. It's followed up by another track, which is not unfamiliar to the hardcore David Bowie fan, I Feel Free, which I think was written by Cream. Let me just quickly clap. Yeah, I think it was written by Cream, and it was performed in the Ziggy era, late 1972, by the Spiders from Mars. It was proposed originally and recorded for the Pin-Ups album in 1975. It was re-recorded for Scary Monsters in 1980. I know, Pin-Ups was 1973. And he took that song and he kind of revisited it again from 1993 and finally nailed it. As I said before, a magpie that didn't let go of anything, remembered everything and took it there. Black Tie, White Noise is song 4, and this is probably my least favourite Bowie single. It's an original composition. It has a perhaps an amazing rap by Albie Shaw. It kind of tried to cast itself as like David Bowie's version of what's going on for the 90s, around looking at the world through the prism of celebrity and riots and capitalism and slavery and inequality and all those things. But it didn't quite work. It took on some of the themes which you'd had from songs like Shopping for Girls, for example, but it didn't. I always felt that it didn't quite hit the mark. It was a good attempt, but it didn't quite succeed in whatever it was trying to achieve. And having the title Black Tie, White Noise also felt a little bit too calculated, a little bit too obvious, like going, well, white noise is good, isn't it? But personally, I always like my Bowie weird and dark, and so the idea of fetishizing white noise and tying it in with the idea of respectability, it was a little odd. I think it just didn't work for me as a single. Which I didn't buy. Black Tie, White Noise did hit the UK top 40 and then disappeared like a stone, or sank like a stone is probably the more technical way of describing it. The next track is Jump They Say, and so I'm going to change the things I'm looking at here, because Jump They Say was probably Bowie's last major big hit single of his career until 2013. Everything after that, respectable, but not an enormous hit. Jump They Say was a huge hit. It was really quite successful indeed. And I think that it's really important, actually, I should say, that the video for Jump They Say casts Bowie as a kind of like an employee of a powerful and somewhat faceless corporation with a somewhat legal aspect to it. So if you're familiar with Bowie's appearance as the agent in Twin Peaks, it's almost drawing a thematic line between his appearance in Twin Peaks as an FBI agent that got lost deep undercover and then the video itself. Also, Jump They Say is the first song which I think, apart from all the Mad Men, which really appears to address the death of David Bowie's half-brother Terry, who committed suicide on, I think, the 16th of January 1985 by putting his head on the train tracks outside East Croydon. And if I remember correctly, the asylum that he was in, which is featured on the cover of Metropolis, or the original covers of The Man Who Sold the World, was a place that I walked past actually quite a lot about 20 years ago, just before it was demolished when I worked in Croydon. It was his biggest hit since 1985. It was impressionistic. The video has quotes from, or more correctly, allusions to 2001, Hitchcock, Metropolis, Twin Peaks, elements of Let's Dance and Lodger, and it was very obviously a product of its references. But like all great art, it's a unique combination of influences that is distinctly and exclusively particularly him. Is it a great song, Jump They Say? No, probably not. And the fact that it was backed with 8 different mixes of the song, including remixes by Left Field and Jack Dangers of Meat Beat Manifesto, Brothers in Rhythm, and so on, doesn't make it necessarily any good. It's good, but it's not great. An overrated song, I think it is fair to say. The next song is Night Flights. Night Flights is to my mind, it's a Scott Walker cover. Scott Walker was a huge influence, and once you can see the path that Scott took in his work, both as a solo artist and past his immediate period of kind of like success. So remember, he did The Sun Don't Shine Anymore and all that kind of stuff, and Jackie in the 60s. And then he just took his money and he went weird, and he just did whatever the hell he wanted. And by the time he got to the albums with Sun-O and I think it's Tilt as well, those are some dark, weird records made by a man that really is following his own path. He's going, I'm doing what I want to do with the money that I've earned doing the things that everyone else likes, and I'm going to do whatever I want, however I want to do it. And you can hear the influence of Scott Walker on The Next Day. You can hear it on Black Star. You can hear it on parts of Buddha and Suburbia as well. The idea of being almost adjacent to the form, knowing how a chorus works, knowing how a verse works, knowing what makes a song easy and direct, and then not doing it, but doing what he wanted to explore, the direction he wanted to go in, which was something that was a little bit different. It was kind of like if you were looking at life from an angle like that. It's still recognisably that, but it doesn't look quite like it, does it? It looks a little bit weird and a little bit strange. The same way that if you looked at, for example, the cover of Buddha of Suburbia, for example, and you looked at it like that, and you kind of go, well, you know, the Scott Walker stuff was kind of like looking at life from a very tilted angle, but it worked, and that's what mattered. And so we also had that with Pallas Athena, which is the next track on the album, which is, I think, the weirdest song, or at least one of the weirdest songs that Bowie ever put on an album in the 90s. Very reminiscent, actually, of stuff like from Low and Lodger and Heroes. Is a kind of almost like a sound collage. It kind of brings itself in, and it doesn't really have anything in the way of a conventional chorus. It's more just like an excursion through sound, using production as a songwriting tool. It's a trick which we heard a lot of on Buddha of Suburbia, and it's almost as if Buddha of Suburbia is almost a selection of B-sides. If Black Tie White Noise is, you know, the vocal side of Low and Heroes, Buddha of Suburbia is almost the instrumental side of the albums, and you could hear these two as actually being a double album that were recorded very near to each other with the same kind of general approach and ideas that sat within it. We did have a couple more songs on the album, by the way, on Black Tie White Noise. We've got Miracle Good Night, which is, I think, one of the most direct and obvious of the love songs that he's ever written. Reminiscent to me, actually, of you know, Amazing as well. It's kind of got this approach of just, it was a single. Did it sell particularly well? No idea. And to be honest, I wasn't paying attention to chart positions at that point in my life. I genuinely couldn't give a fudge about it. The thing that really mattered to me was that the artists that I loved were able to continue to make the music that they wanted, that felt true to them. Everything else I didn't really care for, whether the artist played a stadium or whether they played a tiny club. I just wanted them to be happy and to carry on making the music that they liked. And if they were big, great. And if they weren't big, well, ideally I'd hope they'd find a way to make it work. So when you think about, you know, the bands that I love that have had to go and get J jobs because being in the band doesn't make enough money, obviously that's a great shame, and I'd rather that not be the case. But at the end of the day, I don't discriminate on anything apart from, does it resonate to me? Does it hit me? Does it work with me? And Black Tie White Noise didn't really at the time. I'd grown into the album over time, and some of the songs I don't like. So Black Tie White Noise, Miracle Good Night is a bit obvious. Don't Let Me Down and Down is okay, I guess, but it's very conventional in terms of its structure. It's a cover version of a track by, I think, a Mauritanian princess, whose name is Tihar, I think. I've never pronounced that. And there is an Indonesian vocal that was released on the Indonesian version of the album, which also, by the way, is on this 3-disc reissue version of Black Tie White Noise. And then we have Looking for Lester, again another instrumental, taking the name Lester from Lester Bangs, the art critic. And then we have two songs to close the album. One is a cover version of Morrissey's I Know It's Gonna Happen Someday. And I Know It's Gonna Happen Someday is, to me, one of my very, very favourite Morrissey songs. Because I know Morrissey is an artist who perhaps hasn't aged particularly well, but the ending of I Know It's Going to Happen Someday, which is on the Your Arsenal album, features the coda from Rock and Roll Suicide. And so Bowie covering that is Bowie covering Morrissey, covering Bowie, if that makes sense, and doing it in a different way. But what it really does is it just highlights the difference between the two at the time. And whilst you would have thought, oh, Bowie covering Morrissey, that's going to be amazing. Oh, no, it's depressingly conventional, I'm afraid to say, the cover version of I Know It's Going to Happen Someday. And it kind of takes the arrangement that you would have had, and then from the Spiders of Mars version. So, for example, the ending of Rock and Roll Suicide, the I Know It's Going to Happen Someday by Morrissey was almost a homage to Bowie in 1973. It effectively takes that track and then turns it into what it would have been played like if it had been played in 1974 on the Plastic Soul tour. And it's a bit overwrought, it's a bit overblown. It's not particularly good, truth be told. and I can't really pretend that it isn't. It's not great. And then we've got the wedding song, which is, again, a variation upon the track itself. There was a third single that was released from the album. So we had Jump They Say, Miracle Goodnight, and Black Tie, White Noise. And then the album fell out of the charts. David was offered an appearance on MTV Unplugged. He turned that down. He made 2 US TV appearances. And the album was massively overpraised at the time. I was listening to it and going, it's not very good. It's a bit average. Although I've grown to like it over time. But now, looking at it from this point, it makes a lot more sense in the rearview mirror than it did at the time. It was very, very hyped at the time it came out. It sold a lot of copies. And to me, there was a little bit of a difference between what happens when you have artistic independence and liberation, where you're able to do whatever you want to do, and then not necessarily knowing when you're lost in the weeds. And there's elements of songs that are on this that are clearly a little bit lost. If you'd taken the best songs from Black Tie and the best songs from Buddha, and you put them together into one, you'd have something that would be up there with Low and Heroes, but you don't. You have 2 albums. And of course, releasing 2 separate albums out of the same era was very common. But of course, the songs for Buddha of Suburbia were not written at the time that Black Tie, White Noise came out, and Savage Records in the US went under weeks after its release, to the point where this next album, Buddha of Suburbia, didn't even get a US release, which is, to me, you know, a great shame. Black Tie, White Noise got a reissue. I think this came out in 2003 as a way of putting the album back in print for the first time in 10 years. It's 2 CDs and a DVD that opens out into this very nice little kind of package, and then you open this out here, and it tells you, oh, David Bowie, Black Tie, White Noise, and you've got a CD here which you kind of fold out. This is a single CD version of the album there, reclaiming the album from where it had been lost. And then you had a double CD version of well, a 2-disc set of extra material. So we've got the limited edition there, which features 14, I think, no, 12 songs featuring remixes of Jump They Say, Miracle Goodnight, Black Tie, White Noise, non-album tracks, Real Cool World and Lucy Can't Dance, as well as remixes of, I think, Palace Athena and You've Been Around. And the DVD that's in here is effectively the sell-through VHS that works as the TV promotion for the album. And Bowie frequently didn't tour his records. He didn't tour Young Americans, for example. He didn't tour, I think, Lodger or Scary Monsters. And so instead he turned to TV promotion as a way of selling the work. And there we are. So having turned down MTV Unplugged, which was, in retrospect, possibly the best and worst idea he'd had. The best one, because you think about the artists that had gone through MTV Unplugged in 1990. In the 90s, so you had, you know, Aerosmith and Nirvana and The Cure and Page and Plant and Pearl Jam and all these, but it was a kind of like fake authenticity. It was an attempt to be real, which you couldn't actually be, because it was an artifice, you know, and it would have, I think, seen Bowie as a legacy act, which he shouldn't have been, and absolutely wasn't. He was still current and new and making new material. And there are some artists that when they do new material and you kind of go, here's one from the new album, and everyone goes, oh God, really, David? Do you have to go and sing that one? No one really cares. Whereas in my opinion, this stuff was absolutely fudging brilliant. Admittedly, now I've said that Black Tie, White Noise isn't my favourite of his records, but it's not my favourite. But for an artist who's in his mid-40s, who's just got married and is richer than God, and can do anything he ever wants to do, it's certainly far, far better than the kind of absolute drivel that somebody like Rod Stewart was pulling out at that point, where you very clearly lost contact with whatever it was that made you great to start with. And so, with that in mind, Bowie addressed his past clearly and directly for the first time in his career by recording the soundtrack and preparing the soundtrack to the BBC television adaptation of Hanif Kureishi's novel, The Buddha of Suburbia. Yes, I've changed the CD cover around, which again, I didn't buy this when it came out because I had very limited money and I had other bands that I liked more. It was released in November 1993. The whole album was done and dusted in 20 days. It was recorded for 6 days. It was mixed for 14 days by Bowie and Erdal Kizalkay in his last major kind of contribution to Dowie's discography, with Lenny Kravitz appeared on guitar, and I think Mike Garson came back and played piano a little bit as well. And it was, I think, probably autobiographical. It was David writing songs about his childhood and his adolescence, and having watched Buddha of Suburbia when it was recently repeated on the BBC relatively recently, and it's fascinating to watch from a 30-year distance and to see the differences and the similarities, and to see how you could have looked at that and went, that is my version of the 70s. Now, if they'd have done a version of Buddha of Birmingham, for example, I might have went, well, it's got to have Snobs and Mr. Egg in, and it's got to have all this stuff. But again, I could probably be watching that like I watched the adaptation of Jonathan Franson's The Corrections, who's a novelist who's focused a lot on historical Birmingham, and to go, I've never seen the world that I recognise on television before. I had this when I watched American TV and American films, is you end up watching it and going, it doesn't look real because it's Chicago, and I've never been to Chicago, so I don't know whether it's actually an accurate representation. And when I was in Chicago, and again, I was going on the metro, and you look down the various kind of alleyways, and you go, oh God, yeah, that's the alleyway where that happens, and that's the alleyway where there's the phone box. So they have the telephone box, and the car goes to, the truck goes towards it in the Matrix, and all that type of stuff. And that's where, you know, whatever his name is, the Sausage King of Chicago in Ferris Bueller's Day Off appears. That's where that type of stuff became real. So, whereas Buddha of Suburbia, although it was set in Bromley, and I think Bowie spent his time largely in Beckenham, and was born in Brixton, it felt like a somewhat semi-autobiographical retelling of the life in the 70s or the 60s, when you're somebody that feels like they don't quite fit into society. And where you feel that somehow you see the world in a very different way to the vast majority of other people, and yet somehow you're forced to exist within it, and to somehow tolerate a world that would not be of your making or your design. And I think it's one of his best LPs, actually, because it's quick, it's fast, it's instinctive, it's not overthought. And sometimes when you work on instincts, the technical elements of it aren't perfect, but the spirit is correct. And certainly when I write things, for example, sometimes I write songs and I write them and it takes me 10 minutes to write a song, and it just pours out of me in one huge lump, and then that's it, and it's all there on the floor. And I think this is what happened with Buddha of Suburbia. It was done quickly, and it was taken from, you know, little fragments of music that David had written that appeared in the TV show, and then he built them up into songs using motifs and extrapolating out all the possible permutations of an idea. And created what I think is one of his most fascinating and underrated late period LPs. It opens with the title track, Buddha of Suburbia, which I think is a wonderful title track, and it's the only substantially vocal song on the album, where he's got some lines about, for example, so I wait until we're sane, wait until we're blessed, and all the same, full of blood, loving life and all it's got to give, Englishmen going insane, can't tell the bullshit from the lies. And it's, there's just this lovely line in Living in Lies by the Railway Line, pushing the hair from my eyes, Elvis is English and climbs the hills, can't tell the bullshit from the lies. Sometimes I fear the whole world is queer. And that stanza there, that's, you know, when I was 17, I lived by a railway line. I was pushing the hair from my eyes because I couldn't find a haircut that I liked. I couldn't tell the bullshit from the lies because there was a lot of bullshit that was going around, and I felt like the only person in the town sometimes. And I know I wasn't, because Birmingham had 1 million people in it, and it had thousands, tens of thousands of people my age in it. sometimes I fear the whole world is queer, and you kind of sat there and going, everyone is weird and unique and beautiful and a little bit strange, and everyone is being squashed down to fit into a box. You think about the brutalist architecture that you have in a lot of modern cities, a lot of grey, a lot of square, a lot of sharp lines. And then you think about somewhere like Barcelona, which has absolutely fascinating architecture, especially by Gaudi, that's very kind of circular and rounded and unconventional, and it's form, not function, that matters. And then you look at brutalist architecture, like, for example, the now demolished Birmingham Library, a place that now King Charles, when he was Prince, once Prince Charles described as a place that was more suitable for burning books than for reading them. And you kind of think that those kind of buildings that are square and flat and grey are designed to crush thought and imagination. And if those buildings were, let's say, orange, and if they were circular, and if they were imaginative, the world would be better and nicer, and we feel like we had, you know, that we weren't actually living in prisons or workplaces that were, you know, crushing human thoughts. You know, the idea of wearing a suit and a tie and going to an office every day, wearing a uniform like a school uniform, designed to kind of squash out all the individualities around you that make you unique and beautiful and different. And then sometimes I fear the whole world is queer, sometime, but always in vain. And then the idea that actually everyone's a little bit strange, and everyone is pretending to be a grown-up, and everyone is pretending to make this up as they go along and hope that it looks like they know what they're doing, and everyone is improvising, and there is no normal person, and what's normal anyway? You know, it's socially acceptable to be massively obsessed by football, for example. And this, by the way, is not a criticism of football, it just doesn't work for me. In the same way, it should be socially acceptable to be able to quote, you know, catalogue numbers for New Order singles. And by the way, New Order singles always had catalogue numbers that ended in 3, and the albums always ended in multiples of 50 when they were on factory records. Why do I know that? I don't know, but I do. That's how it works. That's how having an obsessive attention to detail works with certain things, and we're all a little bit strange. And for me, Buddha of Suburbia is one of David's most important songs, because it actually addresses that. Is everyone's a little bit weird and everyone's a little bit different, and we're all trying to just fit in amongst the bullshit and the lies, you know. And it's just it's just one of my favourite LPs of his, actually. I could just sit there and just go, but this song, that song, oh, they're brilliant. Wouldn't be interesting. So let's try and think about how I talk about this, which I can't. It's difficult, because normally I latch onto the lyrics in an album, and this is by far the most instrumental of Bowie's records, with the smallest lyrical content, and all the songs on the album are credited only to him. They're built out of the improvisations, built upon the motifs which came into the soundtrack, so it's clearly just a glamorised, although it's a new and unique David Bowie solo album, because it was regarded by many people as a soundtrack album to a little-seen British TV programme. Oh, I've got 2 copies of the CD. You know, not that many people saw Buddha of Suburbia as a TV programme. The cover of it originally was a photo from the TV broadcast, so it didn't look like a Bowie album. The only way that you knew it was a Bowie record is because it said music composed by David Bowie right at the bottom, and David Bowie on the spine. If you were looking for the album, the new David Bowie album, you could completely miss it. And sometimes it might be filed under, for example, it might have been filed under soundtracks, and who's going to look for the new David Bowie album in the soundtracks? And for example, you know, the cover of the original CD didn't have a picture of him on at all. In fact, the LP was only, the vinyl version was only released in Brazil, where they sold a few hundred, and sold for, you know, half a grand at one point to the particularly keen members of the fan base. And I'm going to go into the Brilliant Adventures book, actually, and see if I can find the photo of the original cover for you. But it's certainly, in my opinion, one of his best, and certainly one of his most underrated and underappreciated albums. It's got, apart from the title track itself, it has 8 largely instrumental tracks. The vocals are small, scant, and barely there. If I'm honest, they barely address, you know, anything that's going on in the LP, or anything that's going on in the song. So there's the track Sex and the Church, which is built upon just a line, sex and the church, and then kind of works its way through. And here, by the way, this photo here at the bottom, that's what the cover was of the original soundtrack album. No wonder people looked at that and went, that's not a David Bowie LP. And although in the booklet it says in many respects this is David Bowie's most important album of the 90s, you know what? I think they're absolutely right. It certainly is, because it's the first one that really addresses past as a living event. You know, the idea of history being something that changes in front of you constantly, and the tides of time just constantly washing over whenever you've appeared. You know, in the time which I've lived in the town which I live in now, the town has transformed dramatically. I remember what it used to be, and there is very little record of that. I remember what my Birmingham used to be. You know, the idea of going out on a Friday night and going to somewhere like Snobs or Excels or the Pots of Beer, all places that don't exist in the places where they used to exist. Edwards number 8, where I was at least once a week. And sometimes, you know, on Wednesday nights, getting the late bus home, getting in at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, getting up at 8 and going to work and feeling a bit crappy because I was 19 or 20 or 21 and I could do it. You know, there's so little of that exists now anymore. The idea of history being forgotten and paved over and mythologized. And Buddha of Suburbia is, I think, the first Bowie record that really kind of addresses the fact that the past is a foreign country, and you not only can you not visit there, you know, sometimes there's very little record of the past ever existing as such. Eventually, when you think about, for example, if two people are in a relationship and they both die, then that relationship disappears really forever, unless there's songs or films or books or children out of that. You know, there's whole years of my life that at some point pretty soon will have just disappeared, and only I will remember them, and obviously I'm not going to live forever. Buddha of Suburbia is Bowie addressing that through the prism of a lost adolescence, which he can never go back to, can never recapture. And of course, the nostalgia ain't what it used to be. Of course, it wasn't that good when you were there at the time. It has, and this album has a number of brilliant songs on it, right? South Horizon, by the way, which is Bowie's favourite, is I think an absolutely great song, very reminiscent of Twin Peaks, the Twin Peaks theme, in so much as it was played forwards, then it was played backwards, then the song was built up from on top of that. So there's a degree of reckless studio experimentation, the idea that I can just do whatever I want. It's a soundtrack album. No one's really going to be paying attention. I can just get away with whatever. And that sense of reckless experimentation, the idea of this is what I do when nobody's really looking, comes through the Buddha of Suburbia like a stick of rock, and it makes it one of his most vibrant LPs, certainly of his career. It's got what I regard also to be one of the great Lost Bowie songs of all time, Strangers When We Meet, which was later repurposed and re-recorded for the Outside album. And Strangers When We Meet is, it should have been his last huge song, actually. It should be up there with Absolute Beginners and Modern Love and Blue Jean and songs like that. It should be regarded as an absolute classic of his body of work. It's got a double-edged sword in the lyric, because the lyric is around two things. The first one is the well-known phrase "strangers when we meet," which is used in both "Walk On By" and later on in Soft Cell, "Say Hello, Wave Goodbye." The idea of being, well, you know, in the eyes of the public, we're strangers, even though we're intimate. You know, the idea of infidelity and cheating and all that type of stuff comes through in the use of the phrase. And "Strangers When We Meet" is also, I think, the name of a Kirk Douglas film about someone that has a torrid affair and all that stuff that goes with it. But there's also, and this is where the lyric is particularly great, is it lends itself to the interpretation around the couple that have been together for so long, is that they've started to drift away from each other and they've started to become strangers to each other, so they are still strangers when we meet. And it's a song that I think should be much, much better known in the Bowie body of work. And of course, if you're strangers when we meet, don't tell anybody, right? Shh. Yeah, that type of thing. Or maybe I'm reaching far too far. This is, you know, executive overreach and executive, or more correctly, artistic misinterpretation. There's a number of other songs on this album, which, by the way, are absolutely fantastic. Basically, what I'm saying is, listen to this record. It's really bloody good. And because it's overlooked, because it's regarded as a TV soundtrack, an insubstantial fluff compared to, but it's as important as any other record that he made. It really absolutely is. And there's just this concept in the whole album, from the way that he's writing the songs, the lyrics that he's writing, and how he's manipulating existing sounds and looking back at his own past and reinterpreting it, bringing Mike Garson back on to play piano, for example, for the first time in a few years. It's about letting go of, or accepting, the past as it was, has gone forever, and that this is now, you know, David Bowie, 20 years on, now well established, and certainly extremely very fucking rich indeed, looking at his child and going, that kid David Jones, who wanted to be David Bowie when he grew up, got to be David Bowie, but has lost, you know, a part of it, in the same way that everyone that's grown up there's still a part of me that's the 18-year-old me, but there's an awful lot of extra layers on top of that, and those layers are just life and how to live it over the years. I think this is one of my favourite David Bowie LPs, Brother of Suburbia. I cannot emphasise that enough. I think the world of it. It is astonishingly good. And I think there's a case to be made that if you take the best of Brother of Suburbia and you take the best of Black Tie, White Noise, and you put those two together, is that you could have something that could easily be you know, as good as Low or Heroes or Station to Station. You just take the I'll Be Sure raps off, definitely, off Black Tie, White Noise, and go from there. I think 1993 was a great year, actually. It was the year where David's work, he stopped being an observer of humanity and became a participant in it, and started to look at his own life and how he fit into the narrative of it. And it's also, by the way, one of the very few Bowie albums that has any sleeve notes by him. And he simply kind of talks about, my personal memory stock for this album was made up from an almighty plethora of influences and reminiscences from the 70s. And here is just a tiny selection of what went through my mind while writing. And he lists the bands that he loved, the places that he loved. Croydon, for example, and Mark Bolan, and T-Rex, and Travels Through Russia, Pet Sounds, Friends of the Craze I Had Known, Mum. This is him looking back upon his life and telling you what he thought of it. You know, wasn't it amazing that we were here and this happened and we lived it, and some of us are still here to remember it. That is the Brother of Suburbia as an album. It is my favourite, or one of my very favourite David Bowie records, actually. It's in my top 5. And if you don't know it, listen to it. I strongly recommend it to you. Black Tie, White Noise, not one of my favourites. I don't recommend it quite, or anywhere near as highly as David Bowie. But again, if you put the best of both of these two together, you'd have something that people would be going, incredible! But they didn't. Black Tie, White Noise performed well, but it disappeared because the label died and people forgot that it came out. It's as simple as that. There was a lot of stuff that was happening in that year. I didn't buy it. I was very limited in what I could and couldn't afford, and I'm sure a number of other people didn't. But the thing that happened next was where I became a Bowie fan forever, and that will be my next one, where I talk about the 22nd studio record, or 20th, depending on your point of view, Outside. But that is a tale for another time. Get in the car, no time to explain. So thank you for watching. If you made it all the way through, this is yet another David Bowie LP. And this most definitely is not just another David Bowie LP. Brother of Suburbia is one of his best. I love it dearly. Please give it a listen. Okay, next one. Don't know what I'm going to be talking about then, but take care of yourselves and each other. I will see you soon. And if I don't see you before, we're just coming to the end of 2022, so Happy New Year and Merry Christmas if you've just had it, of course. And if you haven't, you could be watching this in December 24th, 2023, although you probably won't be. Happy holidays? Yeah, I really should work on my endings a little bit better, but no matter how bad my endings are, they aren't as bad as The Rise of Skywalker. Hell, even going to work is better than The Rise of Skywalker, and that's where we'll end it. Okay, see you all some other time soon. Take care of yourselves and each other. Bye.